I have made over 100 quilts in my lifetime, and I have done the binding both start and finish by machine on every single one of them. So I'm proud to admit I'm slowly getting better and better at my technique. So today I want to really focus on a bunch of different machine binding techniques. A lot of this could actually also be done by hand. Got a bunch of fun things to show you. Let's get started. Now, before I can walk you through putting the binding on the quilt, let's make some binding. I have done this, like I said, the same way over and over for years. I always start straight of grain, so cut with the grain of the fabric, 2.5 inches wide, and I am now learning to miter my corners. So when I'm mitering, we'll do mitered corners in a second too, mitering my binding together or putting the binding together on the bias. So one of my 2.5 inch strips, I'm gonna take and I'm gonna fold a corner here. Let me make sure I show you what I'm doing first. These will be sewn right sides together, and I've chosen a fabric today that really shows the wrong and the right sides. And eventually I'm going to be sewing from this top corner down to this bottom corner. And I feel pretty comfortable doing that kind of by eye, but if you're not comfortable, I'm going to teach you to prepare the corner first with your iron, so you have a stitch line. And I just lay it out on the binding itself first so I know which direction we're going. Okay, so it's always the top corner down to the bottom corner. That becomes my top stitch line, basically. As you can see here, it's going to lay in. And I'm coming over to the sewing machine. I have it prepared for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I'm not worried about the 1/4 inch because I'm going to trim the 1/4 inch into the seam as I finish here. So I want to make sure this is nice and clean. The more square we start, the better off we are going to be. And I'm putting the needle right in that crease I created with my iron. As you finish this off, you're going to prepare to trim. Now, if you've never done this before, I strongly recommend you make sure you've gotten it correct. So I'm going to open it up and make sure that my binding is correct like that. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to use my ruler to keep my hand safe. And I'm giving myself basically a 1/4 inch seam allowance, setting those aside for later. And now we are basically ready to go ahead and prepare the binding. The binding will be put onto the quilt, as you see here, starting from the back side. And this particular project was one of my little doodle samples, so I'm calling it the black side. And you'll remember that as the back side, right? And you can see it's finished on all sides as we stitch in the raw edges together. So when I prepare my binding, I'm going to prepare this with the iron by folding it wrong sides together, right sides out on both sides. And then I'm going to set it with my iron and I just kind of slide it down. Now, in figuring out how much binding you need, you're going to measure the perimeter of your quilt. Most fabrics are 44 inches long. I use the number 40 as my average length so that I am having that little bit of extra for my bias joining of my binding strips, right? So if I had a quilt that was 40 inches by 40 inches by 40 inches by 40 inches, I would want at least 4 strips. I might even want a 5th strip just in case because of the overlap. So think about your perimeter, figure out how much binding you need, and make one long continuous strip of that binding. As you're pressing it along, I like to take and roll it up as I go so that it stays off of the floor. I have a tendency to try to step on the binding when I'm stepping on the gas pedal for the machine. So I want it tidy and out of the way of the floor. So I'm going to do that with my binding as I get ready to stitch it on to the quilt project. Now, let me tell you what I've done to prepare, because I'm going to use the wonderful binding tool. I love this thing to help me join the final seams together of the actual binding as I'm putting it onto the quilt. And the instructions on this ask us to leave an opening that is 12 inches. So if you look closely, if I'd stop moving it, you could look closely, of course. And what I've got here is I've got one pin where I started, and that's exactly 12 inches to the next pin. I got caffeinated today. So I started sewing before we started rolling cameras, and I am ready to finish the mitering of the last corner. But I just want to point out, with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and this 1/4 inch you want to keep accurate, I have stitched all the way around with my mitering of my corners, all 3, and I'm coming into the 4th corner, and that's where you're going to join along for this finish. Okay, so we're working from the back side. We're going to finish on the front side of this. And the key, if you've never done a mitered corner for your binding, is that you want to sew till you're 1/4 inch from this outside edge, 1/4 inch from the end. I backstitch so that when I'm monkeying around, I don't undo my seams. Then what we're going to do is we're going to fold uphill first. Then we're going to come back down and we're going to fold downhill. And there's two things that I'm really looking for to make sure I'm staying really nice and mitered. This edge lining up, and as I fold this down, the edge of the binding itself laying on top. That's going to make a really nice, clean binding. Then when I come in, I'm going to start basically at the 1/4 inch in mark. So as we're going to the presser foot, I'm going to hold this nice and secure. And I'm going to finish that off with that 1/4 inch seam allowance down to that second pin we've set, and then I'll show you how to use your binding tool to join your binding on the bias while on the quilt. So I'm 1/4 inch from the very back end here, and I'm going to take a few stitches in. Again, I'm going to back stitch, but I'm not going all the way off the quilt. I'm just back stitching to where I started. And now I'm going to sew down to where that pin is. That pin is the end point of my 12 inch that I leave open. And I'll back stitch there as well. Got it, perfect. Okay, now let's get this needle up and out of the way. Bring these over here. And now what I would like to do is remove the pins and talk about this binding tool starting on the one side over there. Okay, as we're getting ready to use our binding tool, and remember, if you need any of the supplies, there's a wonderful link in the description below. You can click on that and get everything you need here. The key to this tool is we're going to use it to cut both sides of our binding. I have a 12 inch opening I've left here, and there's a printed side with the instructions right on the tool. So we always want to make sure we can read this, even if it's slightly upside down. So I take my first end and I'm butting it up to that seam where I started, and then I'm opening up my fabric, and I am using a Sharpie because I'm working on the interior, and I'm going to go ahead and make a line right where that black line is, the black line right there on my marking tool. Now I've gotten in the habit of cutting as soon as I've marked so that I don't have to try to remember which side was which. So let me bring that in a little bit better spot for you to see. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the blunt end right there. And what I'm thinking to myself right now as I'm cutting this is that this bottom edge is my longest edge. That's going to make sense here in a second. Okay, I'm going to slide this back in. If you remember, I had this set just like this and I marked it. So now I'm going to rotate this around like this. So I didn't flip it, I just rotated it. And I'm marking using the same line on the interior. But I used to do an awful lot of construction, so I talk about long points and short points and those kinds of things. And I want to make sure I get them right. So think about it. If this line comes over here, I'm going to make a little sketch that shows me that line needs to go in that direction. And that way, because if I cut this incorrectly, I'm going to be disappointed. I'm going to have to add it back on. Now as I come down here, I'm going to bring this up, and you'll notice I'm cutting it following kind of that sketch I made. Sorry about the arm in the way there. It's a little bit upside down for me the way that I have this set up at the moment. And the cool thing about the binding tool is it also includes the little flat edge that will help us line up our bindings when we come back together. So now I'm grabbing my bindings and I'm making sure they're right sides together, and I still need to join this seam, and it will basically be that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I kind of wrestle with the quilt and the binding as I head myself towards my sewing machine. But then as I get ready to drop the presser foot and the needle, I make sure everything's nice and organized. Again, using those flat edges to really line it up. And that is all you need to know about the binding tool. Whoop, still struggling a bit. And then we'll finish putting this on the back side of the quilt with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'll stop talking so we can get it right. Okay, here we go. Make sure I've got the end captured so I back stitch. And I just love the way this works out each and every time. It's just fantastic. So what's going to happen here, as I pull it, you can see that I've got a beautiful bias there, lays nice and flat. A lot of times folks will take the time to press that. You can even press it right on your quilt if you like, because your quilt makes a really nice ironing surface. Be careful if you have a cutting mat below. You don't want to iron your cutting mat. And now we just need to finish fastening the binding to the back side of the quilt. So I'm going back to where we left off when we had that pin up there. And away we go. And as I come into where I was sewing before, I'm locking that stitch in. This machine's got a thread cutter, so I'm going to cut the thread. And now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the alternative ways that you can finish this. So what I want you thinking real quick is, remember, this was the back side. We're going to take this and roll it to the front side of the quilt, and then I'm going to bring it around. And at this point is where all of the options can start for you. So some of you may be hand quilters. And if you're a hand quilter, you would have done this the opposite. You would have started on the front side, you would have brought the binding to the back, and you would have secured it, and you would have hand stitched it. Now, some of us struggle with securing it and keeping it all tidy and organized. So one of the cool things you can use is a lapel stick. This is just a real easy, nice fabric adhesive. And you could technically take your lapel stick and put it on the binding, not on the quilt. And you could even give yourself a little edge, and you can still hand needle through the lapel stick very easily. So you could roll this around and you could tack it in place. Now, it might take a while for it to set up. So what you might want to use is some of your really cool, these little red quilter's clips, right? So the quilter's clips, as you roll that around, where's that gluey spot? There it is. You roll that around, you can clip it, and then you could come down a ways and you could clip it, and that's going to keep it all organized as you're ready to hand sew. Now, anyone that's been at a quilt meeting has seen your neighbor with a quilt in their lap. They have these wonderful little metal clips. I think they used to be used for barrettes. I'm not sure, but I did have a ponytail at one time. These, a lot of the hand sewers that they don't like to use glue love, because you can snap these things on around your quilt, capturing your binding, capturing the front side of your quilt and the inside of your quilt, and you can lay these around. And I usually see folks space these out. And you notice I didn't say I do it because I don't hand anything. Some of us think hand is a 4-letter word. And they do it about every, 5 to 6 inches apart. And I've seen them go like halfway around their quilt with the metal clips. That's why so many come in a package. So those are all ways you could still do the machine to begin and hand to finish. I'm going to show you how to machine the finish, right? So we can pull these out of the way. Now, my good dear friend Jenny Doan loves to start hers with a 1/4 inch. It's a Easy Steam 2 product. So what this is, it's an iron-on adhesive. It's a 1/4 inch wide, which is perfect for your binding. This could be laid in here. This would be brought around like this. And then you could come in here with your steam iron and you could really set this. And literally, if you're not going to wash and dry your quilt, you're done at that point. You could also run a decorative stitch on top of that glue, and the decorative stitches kind of move the fiber around, so having a glue or an adhesive in there works really nice. Millions of options. I want to show you my personal favorite way though. My personal favorite way, because I'm a machine guy, I love machines, uses a specialty foot. And the last time I checked, almost every brand out there has one of these versions. It's called a bi-level top stitching foot. Let me flip it over. You're looking at the top, and I'm not even sure if you'll be able to see it, but this side right here is thicker by about the thickness of your binding than the rest of the foot. So what's going to happen is this is going to lay right here on the edge of the binding. It helps me keep the binding totally organized and lay my stitch exactly on the edge as I want to go. Your stitching lines will show up on the back, so on the back side of the quilt, you're going to want to use the same color thread in your bobbin for putting the binding on to finish as you did in the quilt itself, so that it looks like it's part of the quilting. So I'm going to put this foot on our machine, and a lot of times if you're not using a 1/4 inch foot, you've moved your needle position well over to the right hand side. So I'm going to now move my needle position well to the left hand side. As a matter of fact, once I get this thread out of my way, I'm going to move it all the way to the far edge, and there's a nice little marking and a nice little opening on there. And because the foot's a little sideways, if you have a drop down presser foot lifter, you sometimes need to kind of wiggle it, or sometimes folks will put their quilt in first and then lower the foot so it holds it nice. Doesn't matter where we start, we're going all the way around the project. I don't start right in a corner, but I'm going to show you how to finish the miter. So let's start close enough to a corner we can get the job done. I'm going to slide this over. And what I like to do is I like to pull it up taut against the side of the quilt. There is a little mark that I can see up on the front edge of the foot, and that's where the binding rolls to. And then I'm going to move that needle position, like I said, all the way over. And then I either pick a place on my stitch plate or a place on the presser foot that I'm looking at, and that's where the outer edge of the binding right here will be running right along one of my markings here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do this, and then I'm going to show you how we finish that miter. And away we go. We're going to tie into that later, so you don't have to backstitch if you don't want to. And at this point, I slow down. I make sure that the quilting is all stuffed into the binding. And as I go around, I'm about 4 inches, now 3 inches, now 2 inches, and stopping from the corner to the needle. And a lot of times I have a little pair of scissors or a stiletto or an awl or something handy. And what I'm going to do, let me bring you in really close and show you. Now that you're in nice and close, let me point out, there's the marker on the foot. This is where that thickness of the foot is, and it's really helping me keep everything square. And I'm coming in to miter this corner, so I've been kind of organizing it as I got close, within about that last 4 to 5 inches. And as I keep taking a few strokes, as I get close enough, I'm going to stop. I use a scissor, you can also use a stiletto, and I kind of use my scissor to help crease that edge right there. Then I'm bringing it up and over, and I'm going to use my scissor, let me get my thumb out of the way. I'm going to use my scissor to actually hold that fabric safely so I don't pierce myself as I feed it under. And then as soon as I feel like the foot is catching, and if you get a little bit of a wad there, you can control that, lift, drop it. And as I come in, once I hit that corner, I'm going to take and I'm going to pivot. And even if you feel like you've gone a hair too far, that's okay. Just take a stroke back towards the edge and then line back up on that marker of your foot. And now you're just going to go back to business as usual, running that binding underneath that seam allowance. And you can see how the needle has moved far, far to the left-hand side of my presser foot as well. So we've got 4 corners to handle, and we are done. So as I'm coming in here to my last 2 inches, I can see that it's coming together beautifully. And so I've got my finger on the reverse button. So as I go over where I started, I'm going to backstitch. I'm not going to do a ton of it. I want it to be hidden. I don't think I mentioned that I actually was using a green thread on the top. I know I told you to use the matching bobbin on the back side. And this I'm going to pull out and I'm going to scissor cut. I'm not going to use my thread cutter because a lot of times our thread cutter will go ahead and cut in the middle of the foot, and I had my needle moved way over, so it would make a funky stitch. Now let me flip this over so you can see. Oh, and I got it right where I had a little bit of thread hanging. So you can see here, there's the line. And every now and again, it'll hit the binding, and you can actually kind of hear that once you get comfortable with it. But a lot of times it runs really nice and smooth and clean. It matches nicely. From the top side, it absolutely looks terrific. It has a nice little lip, holds great. It's incredibly fast. I think about, I don't know, maybe a week ago, I had 5 quilts to bind for my shoot here at Man Sewing, and I sat down, had all my binding ready, and I spent maybe an hour and a half and bound 5 large quilts. It was very easy. So let's go back over the key points here, right? While you're putting your tips and your tools in your toolbox, let's get these keys down. You started on the back side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we rolled to the front, we put on a top stitching style foot, and we moved our needle to the far side so that it was marking right along the edge of our binding. We were still able to miter our corners. We did all of the construction as needed, and it turns out fantastic, and it turns out fast. So that is a bunch of machine binding basics, a couple of tips on how to do it by hand if you like, and I am jazzed to get to share with you some of the things I have been learning over the last few years. Make sure you're subscribed here at Man Sewing, and we'll see you next time.